Tonight's topic, as Renza talked about, is human dignity in the marketplace. And tonight we're going to focus on labor. We're going to have a series of these. This is a series that's going to take place over a number of months as we finish this year and move into the next year. And tonight, what we're going to be listening for, and what Father Raymond is going to walk us through, is the extent to which Christian social thought on economics has echoes in or dissonances with modern economics as it's discussed today, whether on the more Hayekian or Becker or the sort of libertarian right, or on the more Marxist view. There are times when it will be harmonious with our understanding of human dignity and its place in the marketplace, and there will be times where there will be dissonances. And I hope that he will introduce you to the original melody of economics, and I'm looking forward to hearing him talk about that this evening. So Father Raymond is a senior fellow with Cardus. He's a senior fellow for our work in economics program. And he comes by that honestly. He has an MA in economics from Cambridge. Way back in the day, he was doing original field work in the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken. So he actually comes by and he's done the grunt field work, and he's done the mathematics. He's a professor of economics at Queen's University, a little school that's not quite as good as mine, but just down the road in Kingston. And he's a National Post columnist, so you can read his column on Thursdays. Saturdays. So it's moved. It used to be Thursday in the National Post. I just read it online when it comes up. I'm a typical millennial. He's also a parish priest at Holy Cross Parish in Kemptville. And this is where I get to make fun of my Protestant self, because I've gone to church with Father Raymond a few times. And what I always love about the Catholics is not just the tradition, the richness of their liturgies, but the fact that they tend to be more economical with their homilies. Those of you who know the Reformed tradition know that being economic with our language is not our strong point. So you can have sermons that go 40, 50 minutes, and you can even see by the way I'm talking that I come from that tradition. So I'm going to end here. I'm going to welcome Father Raymond up, and please join me in welcoming Father Raymond.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you, Brian. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you to my colleagues, Brian, and to Renze, who was kind enough to begin the evening by pointing out where the exits are for people who might find it necessary. Sorry, I try and find a spot always where you can slip in and out more easily. So Nolan is trapped right up by the window there. So I've been around Cardus a long time. I think Cardus officially started in 2008. It has antecedent organizations. I think I joined in 2009, and even before we had this beautiful facility and so forth. And one of the things that attracted me from the beginning, although when I first came to Cardus, it was not for economics per se, but for a magazine that we started some time ago. And but the roots of Cardus are actually in the Christian labor tradition. There is such a thing as a Christian trade union tradition. That's not how I came to economics. I came to it from an academic point of view. But there's a distinctively Christian way to think about the economy. And when I say that, I don't mean that there's a distinctively Christian economic policy. So Christians can disagree about economic policy, what the tax rate should be or what social assistance rate should be and so forth. But there is a distinctive way that Christians come to think about economics. Not economic policy, but economics in general. And so this series, of which there are 4 talks, this one's about work or labor. One in November, I think it's on liberty or virtues, liberty, and then virtues and charity. So how our Christian way of thinking influences how we can think about economics. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So I want to start with a scriptural passage that is about work. So this is John chapter 5. So Protestants in the room will know exactly where we are. Catholics will wait to hear what I have to say. But So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to ask Brian then to give me the actual chapter and verse. How's that? Well, I gave you the chapter already, so it's pretty easy. Anyway, here it is, John 5. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your pallet," or your mat, I guess. But he answered them, "The man who healed me said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, and there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse will befall you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this is why they persecuted Jesus, because he did this on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working still, and I am working." So, chose that passage to begin because it speaks about the Father who works and the Son, incarnate Son, who is working. So, good introduction to our topic about work. Can you tell me the verses, Brian?
No, but I can tell you the rule of the commandments.
Okay. That's not the verse. Verse 9 to 17. So that's our starting point. So this evening really has two parts. The first part is really what Genesis, first chapters of Genesis tell us about the place of work and how Christians can think about work. And then the second part is about looking at the contemporary modern economy, so let's say for the last 250 years, and how we look at work or how we experience work, and how that has certain echoes or dissonances, as Brian said, with our Christian way of thinking. So that's our plan for the evening. So the first part is really about what the book of Genesis tells us about work. So there are 6 points in both halves. So we've got 12 points. So we're going to go quickly. And while I was preparing this, I noticed that many of the points began with a C. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have them all start with C? So all 12 points begin with C. This is help you remember them. But as you can imagine, that's sometimes not hard. That's not easy to find. So some of them are a bit of a stretch, but there we are. So the first one's not a stretch, but creation. So the basic Christian attitude towards the material world is that it's created. Right? That's how the sacred scriptures begin. In the beginning, God created, which to us living at the end of 2,000 years of Christian tradition doesn't seem at all controversial to us. It may seem obvious to us, but actually that was a kind of polemical statement when it was first written, right? Because in the ancient world, which was very religious, they didn't believe in creation. They believed that the world was somehow pre-existent, or that God was within the world, or the myths of the great civilizations. They start with something, right? Or if you look at the creation myths or creation stories of Canada's indigenous people, they don't begin with creation from nothing. There's something, some actor going on. So the Christian understanding of God is that he's outside of creation and creation comes into being. He creates it, which means he has a pre-existence. So the first question becomes is why have creation? Like, why is there creation? Because if it is God's will that he create, it's possible to imagine no creation. Right? So that's the first thing that Christian thinks about the world, is that it's created, which means it proceeds from God's choice. We're going to leave aside why God creates. That's a different topic. But it does tell us something about God, is that God is not, in the Christian understanding, a removed, remote, self-sufficient, isolated entity. So he comes out of himself or extends himself in some way by his work. He creates. So you could imagine a God who would fit all the qualities, if you want to say, or characteristics that God has, and doesn't create. He's already perfect in and of himself. There's no need for creation. And Christians actually would say that God doesn't need to create. Right? But he does, which tells us something about him, right? That the nature of God is dynamic, extending himself, creating himself. And from the Christian point of view, if we're in the image of God, as Genesis also tells us, then that also tells us something about who we are, is that we are meant to work, right? To somehow extend ourselves, to be creative, right? So that's the starting point. But we can say something even a bit more stronger than that, which is that God in and of himself, perfect in himself, we don't know exactly what that is or who that is, right? Because we don't have any access to that. We only have access to God through his creation, which is the way he reveals himself. So, I have to be precise here, we only know God through his work. He reveals himself in his works, right? Which of his first work is creation. Later he speaks directly or through the prophets, eventually, as Hebrews says, right, in the fullness of time, rather in the latter days he speaks through his Son. But so that means that our knowledge of God is shaped by his work. Okay, so you have to be careful, to be theologically precise. God doesn't change. If he could change, then he's not God, right? So there's a certain unchanging nature, but his revelation sort of shapes how we understand him. Right? So in a certain sense, how we know God and what we know of God is shaped through his work. And that's an important principle for us, because we'll see it later that our work also reveals ourselves and shapes ourselves. So our work reveals something about who we are, and it also shapes in a way who we are. Right? So that's the sort of a starting point, just on the fact that God creates. Right? So in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. We know that God is dynamic, active, which means also he's personal, right? Because this is not just an unmoved mover or a state of being, but someone who actually has a relation through his work with something, and actually with someone, namely the persons in creation, which is the angels and human beings. Okay, so that's the first C, creation. That's an easy one. This one is a bit of a stretch, the second one, but I call it confinement. So we're thinking about work now, not the whole of creation, but about work. The other thing we get in the first pages of Genesis is that God puts sort of confines on work, right? Which is the Sabbath. Right? So he works, but then there's a time where he doesn't work. Right? He rests. This has two implications for how we think about work. One is that there can't be a Sabbath rest unless there's work. Right? This is the point made by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of Great Britain. We had a Cardus event, very great Cardus event with him. I think the audio is still on our website, isn't it? Conversation that we had in Toronto. He and I did it together. I asked the questions. Magnificent theological thinker, Rabbi Sacks, and he doesn't write a lot about economics, but when he does, he says the first thing is if we have a Sabbath, it means that we're made to work. Now, the Sabbath takes precedence, and you have to understand, because this is the passage here from John 5, dispute about the Sabbath, how important the Sabbath was, right? The Sabbath was the heart of God's revelation and relationship with his people, right? The relationship with the Jewish people had two elements. It had a spatial element in the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, and later in the temple, and then in a temporal element in the Sabbath. But the spatial element, you could be far from the temple, or the temple could not be built yet, or the temple could be destroyed. And for the majority of history, the temple was not built, was in ruins, or destroyed. Right? So actually, it's the Sabbath that is the heart of God's relationship with the chosen people. It's their identity is the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is defined by several things, principally worship of God, but really it takes its shape from the confines on work, that there's a limit. So work is important, creativity is important, but there's a limit to work. So that's another principle we would say that Christians, when we think about economics in general or work in particular, is that it has a limit to it. It doesn't explain everything, it doesn't fulfill everything, it shouldn't absorb everything, that there's a limit to it. And actually one of the challenges of our culture today is that it's very hard to keep the Sabbath, right? It was always an effort to keep the Sabbath, especially as the Jews kept it with great rigor. So it was never easy, but it's harder now because, you know, there's not a lot of distinctive, we don't live according to the rhythms of the of nature and the harvest and so forth, and everything is present to us. Just as an aside, what is the number one issue of dispute in the Gospels? You know? You probably guessed by where I'm introducing it, but right. The Sabbath, right? It's not the moral law. It's not doctrinal questions. The number one issue of dispute, in terms of the most frequent dispute in the Gospels, is the Sabbath. And because the Sabbath was at the heart of the religious identity of the chosen people. And when Jesus says that he is greater than the Sabbath, that is a profession of divinity. He says he's greater than the temple and greater than the Sabbath. Right? And everybody knew what that meant, to say that you were greater than the temple. Only God could be greater than the temple, and only God could be greater than the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is very essential. So that's our second point. Third point, commission. So at the beginning of creation, we see that man created male and female, actually, in this sense, when the creation of Adam, is that there's a commission. So man is in creation with a commission, right? And that commission is to steward, to tend to the garden, right? Eden. At first, we're told that there was no man to tend the garden, so God was the aboriginal worker. But then at the creation of Adam, man is given this charge. He's given a work to do, right? So he has a work right from the beginning. So our fundamental identity, before the fall, so it's not a consequence of sin, is that there's a work to be done. And the work to be done is to act as God does. Right? We cannot do what God does, but sort of act as he does, as the common term, Christian term would be steward, biblical term rather, of creation. To tend to things, to look after things that God has created. Right? So that's the first mission, or the reality of man's creation is that he's given a mission. He's committed, a commission is given to him to steward creation. So he imitates God as a worker, right? As someone who works. Our fourth point is communion. So what we see in the first chapters of Genesis before the fall is that there's a profound communion. Right? So there's harmony in the garden. There's harmony between Adam and the animals. They bring all the animals before him to name the animals, so he has some kind of relationship with them, but it's not a hostile relationship, it's a harmonious relationship. Then with the creation of Eve, there's a deeper communion. In fact, Adam expresses a frustration that the communion available with the garden and with the animals is good but insufficient. Right? He says, there's no one here like me. Right? I have some communion, some harmony, relationship with this, but there's no one, it's imperfect. And then finally, when uh, Eve is created, Adam, exalts, right? At last, here's someone with whom I can have a deeper communion, right? And the scriptural text gives us an interesting term. It says that the Lord God made a helper or helpmate. It was kind of an interesting term. You could say companion, you could say friend, you could say, but actually it's helpmate, right? A helper, someone to help. What do you need a helper with? You need a helper to do some task, to do some work, right? So you can make endless jokes about that. Man was incapable of doing his job until someone was sent to help him, right? Those jokes are generally found more humorous by women than they are by men. But it's interesting that the context, you could imagine easily that it said, I will make a companion for him. I will make a friend for him. I will make a soulmate, if you want to use more contemporary language, right? But I will make a helper, right? So you get this fundamental idea of man being given a task, a mission to do. So you have this very profound communion, male and female, harmony with the animals. We see a glimpse of this, jumping ahead in the prophecy of Isaiah, that vision, sort of prophetic vision of, the swords will be turned into plowshares, etc. But the lion will lie down with the lamb, and for us we think, well, how is that good for the lion, right? For the lamb we could see, but is that? But somehow that harmony will be recreated or rediscovered or lived somehow. That's how it was. Somehow in Eden there was this great harmony, and they experienced really the creation as a gift to them. So before the fall, there's no hunting, right? There's no eating of animals, right? There's no hunting. There's no violence. You don't have to kill an animal, right? Now, many people today enjoy hunting, or they enjoy, they delight in sort of maybe eating raw meat or whatever sort of things. But that's actually something that comes into the world. It doesn't mean it's sinful, but it comes into the world after the fall. So the life of man in the garden would have been really receiving a gift. So if you contrast, for example, what it would mean to hunt something and to kill it and then to eat it, compared to, say, taking a fruit off a tree, it's a much different experience. And the cultivation or the tending of the garden was not really farming. There's not plows to be put in the ground and things to be harvested. It was that there's abundant trees with plenty of fruit to eat, and it was easy. So the dominant experience of man in the garden for food, for sustenance, for life was as a gift. Right? Didn't require a lot of work in that sense. Right? The work was tending to the order of things, but his experience of daily life was that of a gift. So you have this vision of profound communion in the garden. And then everything goes wrong, right? Well, not everything, but almost everything goes wrong with original sin and the consequences of that. So that brings us to our fifth point, which is corruption, right? So this good environment, this good reality is corrupted by man's rebellion. Disobedience, pride, sin. And so this disrupts the whole of the order of creation, right? Disrupts everything. Right? So sin transforms not only man's relationship with himself, male and female, not only transforms his relationship with God, but transforms his relationship with the created world. Right? So everything becomes corrupted, right? Doesn't mean it becomes evil in itself, but it becomes, compared to its original identity and vocation, you could say, it becomes corrupted. And what are some of the consequences of that, right? Well, first of all, what's the first work? So the work of man before the fall is to tend the garden, right? To be a steward of it, to give names to the creatures, right? So, and what's the first work he does after the fall? Do you remember? What's that? Yes, they make they sew together the leaves to make clothing. So their first act, their first work is not a kind of, if you want to say, to receive a gift or to make something fruitful, but to cover themselves, right? Because now they have shame, they feel vulnerable, right? So immediately the work of man becomes something lesser than his original vocation, right? Before he was naming things, tending things, letting things flourish, living in harmony. And now the first thing he has to do is to use part of the creation to cover himself because he's embarrassed, he's ashamed. So there's a corruption there, and then the consequences, that's not one of the C's, by the way, it does begin with C, but it's not on our list. The consequences are then specified when eventually the Lord God confronts them in the garden and tells them the consequences. And the main consequence, really, of the fall is that original communion that existed, male and female, with the creation, with God, is replaced by conflict. That's our sixth one. So that's end of part one, sixth, conflict. So now there's conflict, right? There's conflict between male and female, right? That's part of if you listen to the speech of the Lord God explaining what are the consequences of this, he tells them that, your desire will be for your husband, that he will rule over you. There's going to be conflict and tension and friction instead of harmony between male and female. Eventually, we'll see that very dramatically in the first generation, where there's actually a murder, right? So Cain and Abel ends in murder. And in fact, the whole book of Genesis, all 50 chapters of it, can be read as how to fix the problem of sibling rivalry, right? Cain and Abel kill each other, and then in every generation they get better at it. Isaac and just forgotten his name now. Ishmael, thank you. Ishmael and Isaac, they're estranged from each other. Jacob, Israel, and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and that's a different topic. But there's disharmony right there in the heart of what should be a communion in the marital relationship and in the family relationship. Right? You don't need enemies, right? They're fighting amongst themselves. So there's conflict there. There's conflict between them and God, right? Very early on, they start to evade. They don't tell the truth when they speak to God. They evade the truth. Sometimes they even lie as generations will go along. But they're estranged from God. They're afraid of him, right? Instead of going to greet him in the garden, they're hiding themselves. There's conflict with creation, right? So with the serpent, right? Between the serpent and the woman, between your offspring and his offspring, there'll be enmity, right? And then there's hostility, or, well, you can even say hostility, but at least conflict with the land, right? So by the sweat of your brow, you will earn your living. So this is no longer a harmonious tending of the land, but it becomes a subduing of the land, right? So man's stewardship becomes a struggle to steward as opposed to subdue or subjugate, right? And this is, right throughout human history and today, right? That's one of the, the prominence of the importance of ecological issues, environmental issues. That's really at the heart of it. Are you stewarding? Are you subjecting? Are you subjugating? Are you exploiting? But that was part of the reality. So man's work, which was in the garden but to be a steward in sort of a harmonious way, and he received his sustenance as a gift, all that is disrupted. And what enters the human condition very early on is toil. Right? That's one of the translations is toil. So work, to summarize, work is not only not evil, it's actually good and part of man's original vocation because it's in the image of God's revelation. We experience work, and often we speak about work in a negative way because we experience it as toil, or at least can experience it as toil. Right? Toil is the consequence of the disharmony or the conflict that comes after original sin. Okay, That's from the first 3 chapters of Genesis, well, some references to later in Genesis, but that's the way in which where Christians, when we begin to think about the world of work and the material world, the world of the economy, that's where we begin. Those are the kind of principles that we begin with. So that's part 1. So the second part of 2, so you can relax, just of 2, right? Not part 2 of 6, is, okay, what about how we experience work today? And when I say today, I probably mean since about, I don't know, 1750, so coming up on 300 years, or maybe even 1700, or even maybe 1600. So with the shift from what you might say broadly being a largely agrarian way of living, which was how most people lived in most places for most of history, to a shift for what we might call, for lack of a better term, the modern economy, which has, manufacturing and now services and trade, even over long distances, and the kind of world we live in today, which, although we might say compared to 50 years ago, 150 years ago, it's very different today, the real difference is between this largely agrarian world and then what came after it, right? So just as another aside, like the one on the Sabbath in the Gospels, one of the difficulties we have today as Christian disciples is that we don't understand the world of the Gospels in its economic context, right? So all the parables Jesus tells, we can understand what they mean. Obviously, very intelligent people devote a lot of energy to helping us understand it, but we don't know it instinctively, right? For example, we don't know what it is to be on the water and to be afraid, because we've tamed the waters, right? So we have recreational watercraft, and we go out there, and even the fishermen who go out on the sea, where it is dangerous and you can be very frightened, that's an exception. Right? They work hard on the sea, but it's actually not dangerous most of the time. It might be unpleasant, but it's not dangerous out there. Whereas all those stories in the Gospels where they're afraid on the water, it's because the waters were not tamed. They were afraid. It was a place of danger. Right? So we can't really understand that. When we think of the Sea of Galilee, we think of a pleasant lake of recreation, of refreshment, and all the rest of it. We don't think of danger. But if you look at that time, and all the agricultural parables and so on and so forth, so that's the really big change. So if that's what we mean by the modern economic environment, what are things that characterize it, and how does that strike us from a Christian point of view? So the first thing about work today is that we usually think of it in terms of compensation, right? That's our first C, and the second part, first C, is compensation. Yes, why do you work? Why do people work? They say, well, I need to earn a living. I need to be compensated, right, to work. Might be other reasons too, but the reality of working versus not working is largely about, I need to work or I desire to work so I can be compensated, so I can earn something, because then I use it for whatever else that I need or have responsibilities for. Right? And even St. Paul says, right? St. Paul in Thessalonians says, those who will not work should not eat. Right? That's a whole different lecture, but right? That there should be, you're willing to work so that you can be compensated for a good purpose, right? So that you can have sustenance, right? It's important. It's not those who cannot work, those who will not work. That's a different lecture. So the idea of being compensated introduces the idea of earning, right? We say that you earn a living, right? What do you do to earn a living? Right? Well, earning a living is easy to go from that to say, I deserve a living because I've done something, I've earned it, right? So if you object, for example, you were to challenge someone and say, well, you have way too much money, so I earned it, right? And the implication is that maybe if I didn't earn it, it would be a problem, but I did earn it for whatever justification, right? And what does that mean? Well, it means that my living, my sustenance, is no longer thought of principally as a gift. If you could imagine being in Eden, you might say, I have a gift. I stroll out into there's plenty of trees with food that's pleasing to the eyes, and I eat it. We find it very difficult to think about that. Now, we may give thanks to God for his providence for us, for the job we have, for all the things we have. I mean, you can develop a spirit of thanksgiving, true. But at the heart of the way we experience work in the contemporary economy is as a compensation. I've earned it, which is different than I've been given it or I've received it. Now, you can try and combine the two, but you do have to combine the two. Right? And so right away, you begin to see something which is a bit at variance with maybe the biblical vision of creation and the material world and work, is that you move a little bit from gift to what I deserve. Right? And this is a problem, especially because if we have that attitude, it makes it a little bit more difficult to understand the reality of salvation, right? Which is not something that is earned, right? And the scriptures are very clear about that. But that's our reality. We think we work because we need to earn, and so we don't experience really life as a gift. Right? We don't experience life as a gift. So, for example, take a very common phenomenon today, right? So we talk a lot about housing in the country now. Very few young people can save sufficiently for a down payment, right? So they receive their down payment usually as a gift from their parents or other relatives or friends. That's the norm. That's the norm now, actually. In certain markets, I remember I was on a plane once signing a mortgage broker, and I think he was surprised to sit beside a priest, but it was a long flight. It was from Europe. But we talked about economics, which kind of surprised him. But and I remember asking, this is already about 15 years ago, and I said, he's a mortgage broker in the Toronto area. And so I said, what percentage of your clients get their down payment from their, let's say their parents, but I mean from whoever, someone else. They just have not saved enough or cannot save enough. And I remember he had trouble understanding the question, so I clarified. He said, well, all of them. Because I was saying what proportion? He said, no, all of them. There are none that he deals with. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's common enough. So think about how that changes the way you think about your house, right? This is just an analogy to this point I'm making, right? So let's say a young couple, they start off, they've got their first house, maybe they live not far from their parents, and they think their parents come over too often. You can imagine such a situation, maybe. Well, it makes a difference whether you bought the house yourself or your parents bought it for you, right? It might be harder to say, well, mom and dad, maybe you could call before you come over. And say, why? I don't call when I come home to my place. Why should I call when I come over to your place? Right? So that's just a way of analogy, right? It changes, right? How the young couple regards their home if their parents gave it to them or gave them the down payment, right? It changes the way you think about things, right? If you've earned it yourself, you can say, well, hold on a second, I bought this house. You call before you drop by, right? So this is one of those areas where you see that it's not that the nature of the modern economy is sinful, let alone evil, but it begins to challenge some of the ways we might want to be disposed towards that. Probably the most dramatic change in the modern economy is compared to the ancient economy, and the ancient economy would include right up to the Middle Ages. John, if you know my friend John here I was going to say from the Ottawa Citizen, but does it exist anymore? I don't know. Right? John and I have been newspaper columnists for 20 years or longer. And because his brother isn't here, I can say this is the more famous of the Robson brothers. Other brother runs the C.D. Howe Institute. But that's his favorite period, the Middle Ages. He always, when people accuse him of wanting to go back in time, he says, certainly, I want to go back to the Shire, is his usual line. But the biggest change from that world to the contemporary economy is choice, second C for this section. For most of human history, the work that you did was determined by either tradition, namely what your family did. So if your father was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your father was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith, whatever. Or command, meaning that whoever was in charge decided. So, maybe the local duke said, well, I need to build a road, or we need to put a bridge, or drain that swamp, and here I'm going to take these 10 guys off the land and put them there. Right? That was, generally speaking, how you got your work was served either by tradition or by whoever was in charge. Right? So maybe you go work in the army or work for the king or whatever. The contemporary economy, we choose, right? The most common question, one of the most common questions we ask children: what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? What work do you want to do? It's one of the most common things we ask people. We take that for granted. That would have been a very strange question to ask in the biblical times. Right? What do you want to be when you grow up? Right? And this changes dramatically our relationship with work, is that we choose it. And here is something which actually is might say more positive than negative, is that because we choose it, it's caught up with our freedom, with our exercise of freedom, with our goals, with our values, with our mission, vocation in life. It's caught up with all of those things. And so it's much more expressive of my personality, or at least it can be expressive of my personality, right? And because we choose it, it means that because we could choose something different, that in a certain sense, we have to be respected. I'm not saying that exploitation in the workplace is not possible, but I choose to work here. You have to treat me with some basic dignity. If I'm only here because I don't have a choice, I've been commanded to work here, or it's, I'm farming because that's what we do in this family, or, I'm a fisherman because I was a fisherman. But if I've chosen to work here, and you've chosen to hire me, there's a basic dynamic of respect there. You've made a choice, I've made a choice, our freedoms are meeting in a certain way. And although that can be marred by sin, it sets a framework for mutual respect. So when we talk about the dignity of workers and the whole Christian tradition that comes out of that, including the Christian labor movement, that's something that would have been hard to understand back in the Shire, right? Because the fact that we choose our work means it becomes more tied up with our creativity, our freedom, and our dignity, right? So much so, right, that this is, it's a very common question. We ask each other, we meet someone for the first time, we say, what do you do? What do you do? What's your work? That's how important it is. What's your work? Right? Retired people often feel a little bit, sheepish about saying they're retired. You ask most retired people, how are things? What do you say? Oh, I'm very busy. I'm busier than I've ever been, which certainly can't be the case, because obviously that means you don't know how to retire. Right? If you had a job that took 8 hours a day and you're busier now, you don't have it, is it possible to mow the lawn 12 hours a day? It's not possible, right? But they say that. It's very funny. Retired people are always telling you how busy they are. It's because this is probably a bad thing, that we emphasize too much how much our work is part of us. But there's a good side to that, and it does actually, it's the source of a lot of dignity in the workplace, is that we choose our work, right? And just as in kind of an aside, because of Cardus's history in the Christian labor movement, that's the basis of dignified treatment of workers, is they could choose not to work, right? Especially if they choose in concert with others, right? So our third C for part 2 is cooperation. Right? So work, almost all work, I would like to say all work, but I suppose I could imagine some rare situation, is with others and for others. Right? It's with others and for others. We'll talk about this a bit later in the series, but where in life do you find a chance to serve others who are strangers? Say, where in life do I find the chance to serve or cooperate with others for service in with people I know? Many opportunities in my family, amongst my friends. But if you say, where do you find an opportunity to serve others who are strangers, right? It's in our work, right? Most of you probably have never walked up to a stranger and said, how can I serve you? Are you being served? Can I help you? Right? Maybe in some contexts, but it's a rare thing. But it's a very normal thing in the world of business. You go into a shop, that's how people talk to you. Have you been served? Can I help you? Right? Our experience of work is largely cooperative. We work together in a company. We learn to collaborate, to share. That's actually our principal experience of that with strangers. In the family, it's different. But knowing how to get along with, collaborate, share with people who we love is a different thing than to do it on a universal basis or an extended basis at least. So work that is chosen and in the modern economy involves many different parts, a lot of trade. We'll get to other aspects of this. It's very cooperative. Work today is much more cooperative than it was, say, in the year 800. You know? It's almost impossible to imagine somebody doing something entirely by himself, as you could imagine a lonely farmer or shepherd or something like that. Right? So, and that's a good thing, right? Because it builds up those bonds of communion, or at least of cooperation, which could become a community, which could become communion, that were lost, right, in the fall. And if we're going to cooperate with people, we're inclined to see their dignity. Right? Even if we don't have that in mind, we begin to see their strengths, what they can do, right? We're looking for their strong points. What is he good at? What can she help me with? Right? You're looking for the strengths in people, right? At the same time, the modern economy also gives us competition, right? So that's our fourth C for this part, competition. In a way that is accentuated compared to, the ancient world. If you think of the ancient world, the fishermen go out to fish, they come back with their fish. In a certain sense, they're competing with each other, but if there's enough buyers for all the fish that come in, they're not really competing in the way that today you might be competing, right? You apply for a job, there are 5 other applicants, you're competing with them, you'll get the job means those 4 don't. He gets the job means you don't, right? So there's a competition that's built up, right? And so we begin to see people as rivals, competitors, rivals. It might be a friendly rivalry, or it might even be hostility. Right? In times of scarcity, shortage, crisis, you can really begin to see others as rivals. Who gets the job? Who gets the food? Who gets whatever, right? So this is a negative side. There is cooperation. Our dominant experience of work is actually cooperative, but there also is this element that's part of the modern economy in a way that the ancient economy really wasn't, of competition. Competition can be friendly, can be healthy, but we begin to see each other as rivals. And that rivalry can become hostility, right? So there's that dimension, and that can erode how we see each other with dignity in the marketplace. Finally, 2 things that are a little bit more recent than 250 years ago. The last one, or the 5th one, pardon me, so second from the end, is the actual proper term for this in economics is division of labor, but division of labor begins with a D, so I have to find a different word. So I'm going to call it compartmentalization. So, but it's actually there's when I was trying to figure out what word to use, and I said that actually gives us a bit of a different insight, because what happens in the remarkable productivity of the contemporary economy, which is based in large part on the division of labor. You divide labor because you're able to compartmentalize a task. So you say, here's a task, and I can divide it up, right? So before, you have a fisherman who builds his boat, who repairs his boat, who builds his nets, goes out, brings the fish back, cleans the nets, cleans the fish, transports the fish to the market, sells the fish. There's a kind of homogeneity across of action across it all. That's not efficient compared to you buy the boat, or maybe you rent the boat. Even better, you rent the boat, you rent the nets, you catch the fish, you sell the fish to someone else who cleans the fish, takes it to market. So it's much more productive, much more efficient. You get economies of scale and division of labor. Very productive. But it does mean that the work that we do becomes, if you want to say, less integrated. There's something about doing the task from beginning to end that involves more of one's personality, creativity, stewardship than doing one part of it. And when you carry division of labor to a very extended level, you can get tasks that are actually very compartmentalized and maybe not very interesting or engaging of human creativity. So your job is to tighten this screw on 800 carriages that go by that day. Right? So the creativity of building a carriage or a car or a tractor or whatever becomes, instead of a sort of a grand task that engages all kinds of creativity and ingenuity and devotion and discipline, is compartmentalized. So all you do is this little part of it, right? And so we get things like drudgery, right? And lack of creativity. And then you can even get people who resent the work, right? So accounting is not usually thought of as a very sort of exciting human endeavor, but there's actually a lot of creativity and structure and order. But if accounting is compartmentalized to the point that all you're doing is data entry and entering figures, you could say it's less human. It's not undignified. I mean, it's not unworthy. It doesn't offend human dignity in the sense of an exploitation or physical abuse even. But there's something about that. So the modern economy, with its genius of division of labor, of compartmentalizing things, means we lose something of that integration, right? And the vision of Genesis is really that man is sort of living in harmony with everything. He sees things as wholes, right? And now we tend to see things as parts. And that's a challenge. Our work leads us to think of things as parts. And then our final topic, and I'm a little bit over time here, but so our final C is what I'm going to call contraction, which is that because of the nature of work becoming more specialized, perhaps more routine, drudgery, we don't see the wholes but only the parts, we actually see a contraction of work. Right? So if we talked about it in the 19th century, we talked about alienation from work, is that this work no longer corresponds to the fullness of my human personality. I'm alienated from the work. I'm alienated from the revenue from the work, and that's part of the Marxist critique. But you don't have to pursue that all the way. You see that there's a distance between me and my work, right? And now what we're seeing, probably the last 30 years, is we're seeing something where the relationship to work has become so alienated that there's actually a contraction, right? So one of the great American demographers, Nicholas Eberstadt, you may have read his work. He had his book about 3 years ago, is called Men Without Work. Right? So this new phenomenon that you have a declining number of men, working age men, in the labor force in the United States. It's a bigger problem there than in Canada. But there's that idea that work has somehow, for a significant number of people, work is no longer fulfills or affirms their dignity. And so they're withdrawing from the work, which is a relatively new phenomenon. So I think I'll stop there. So those are the modern economy offers the capacity to be realized through one's work, to exercise one's creativity, to develop one's identity, to shape oneself through one's work in a way that the ancient economy didn't do that. And that certainly is, I think, a benefit from the Christian point of view. But there's these other things, the cooperation, also a good thing. But the nature of work also draws us away, or can draw us away, I should say, from that original vision of sort of integrated wholes, man in harmony with his creation, a man in harmony with others, and can lead to rivalry, to division, and even to then a general contraction for work, which is one of the concerns we have today. So I think I'm going to stop there, and then I'm sure there's other things I didn't address you could ask in the question period. All right? Great. Okay, good. Thank you.
I want to follow up on that last point you make about contraction and the fact that it's particularly in the United States, but there are other places in the modern world, South Korea, Japan, almost all places that are quite rich, of contraction from the workplace, people sort of moving away. And I want to ask, you mentioned choice as a sort of modern marker of the workplace. And part of that choice is often connected with self-actualization. So you said, you sort of mentioned, what do you want to do when you grow up? But actually what people ask is, what do you want to be? Mm-hmm. And so there is a conflation of the work with identity. Mm-hmm. And the identity is one where you are self-actualized. You become, I'm a doctor and therefore I've made it. And if you're an immigrant kid, that means you've made it for your dad or your mom, mm-hmm. their wishes for you. But so I'm wondering if there's a link between contraction and this notion of choice, where if it's not the sort of something, if I can't find the job where I'm self-actualized or I'm perfectly fulfilled with my desires and my hashtag passions, which many people say in their resumes, I'm passionate about this. There are very few things I'm passionate about. I love my work, but I'm not, you know what I mean? There's a sense of the workplace becomes tied up with their identity. And so I'm wondering if contraction is connected with choice. And then I'm wondering about the way in which work understood as toil, arriving from conflict, the sort of biblical view that somebody like Marx would say, well, yeah, that's what we have to do is recover that. And even the modern tech bros who talk about UBI or universal basic income as well, let's be honest, most people aren't going to be smart enough to do the programming that actually provides, productive value for the economy. So what we're going to have to do is, provide them with an income so that they can live. Are those things all connected?
What if I said no?
Well, then I would ask you to say why not, because I think I've just made the case that they are, and how.
Yes, the different parts of my talk are connected to each other. I would say that. Just some comments. First of all, it is true. People say, "What do you want to be what do you want to be when you grow up?" But they mean, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Because if you answered, "I want to be virtuous," right, or I want to be happy, or I want to be independent, or I want to be anything you'd say that would be a state of being, that's not what they're asking. So you're correct. There's this conflation of identity with work, which is why we have this retired phenomenon. No one says, well, not no one, but there's this, I'm just as busy now as I was before, right? Even though the whole point of retirement is not to be. But I would say I would go back actually to the first point in the second half of the talk, which is the idea of compensation, is that I work in order to get something, right? And in the Aboriginal vision of work that we see in Genesis, you're not working to get something. It's a commission that you are given to do, and your sustenance actually is experienced largely as a gift, not as the consequence of the work. That's generally the vision of Genesis. Once you get into the after the fall world of I need to earn, I have to work, then your identity becomes wrapped up in that. And then if you don't have to work because I can get something from my savings or because I get super abundant returns, then the whole attitude towards work becomes as a perhaps necessary evil or even a necessary good. But a necessary good, when no longer necessary, can become an evil. Uh, as to the second half of your question about act, act, actualization through your work, I think that's a consequence of as other sources of identity and affirmation um, recede, then your work has to fill up things that it's not meant to fill up. Right? So sometimes you can encounter very capable, even very high achieving, very prestigious people have very high achieving or prestigious jobs, even very lucrative jobs, and their work is unsatisfying to them because they're actually looking for it to do more than even that, is to provide an entire identity. And I think the remedy for that is that if you had sources of your identity in your family, in your community, in your faith, then you don't need to look for your job to provide more. One of the phenomenon we see with very talented, sort of high achieving people is often a lack of satisfaction, uh, and they shift jobs or they're frustrated and so forth. It's because they say I'm not experiencing all that I would aspire to, but that your job is not going to give that to you. But that's what they think will give it to them, and that's a phenomenon more in rich countries than in middle income or poor countries.
Yeah, I just want to make a note that it actually has an impact on things like fertility. We did a study recently. We were asked Canadian women how many children do they want, and then we looked at how many they actually had. And one of the reasons, and then we asked why is there, and there was a gap. Canadian women want more children than they actually have, and then we asked why. And the top numbers was, I want to get established in my work and my identity there as well. So it has implications beyond the economy. I'm going to save my question on charity and justice for the time when you're talking
Okay.
about charity. And I'm going to ask one more question before, and then I'll go to the crowd on the question of cooperation. And you mentioned, I think rightly, that our workplace is one of the rare places where you can serve a stranger. And I think that's true. And I think that anybody who's working in, whether it's government or anywhere, it could be McDonald's, it could be Tim Hortons, it could be at a construction site. It's one of the few places where we interact with strangers at all, let alone helping them. And you said that this could lead to communion. This could lead, the workplace, the economy could be places where it could provide the fertile ground for recovery of that Aboriginal view of work, which it was a place of communion between God and man, between man and woman, between men, women, and creation, etc. I want to ask you what will seem like a very Reformed Christian question, maybe a Jewish question, which is the question of the difference between cooperation, contracts, which tend to be the mark of the modern economy, and covenant, or which was more.
We got C words coming out of oh my goodness
all over the
gracious.
place. I'm adding the
I had 12, but it turned out I didn't even get the main ones. No covenant. No.
But and I'm going to ask this because I think it's particularly salient, because that to some extent was, and I will say it was the pretense, because I think it has been shown to be a pretense of trade with places like China. That, and when I first met Father Raymond, I was actually working for the Christian Labor Association, and we were trying to get Christian trade unionists in Cuba out of jail because they were put into jail. And the response that I kept hearing from the Canadian government at the time was, we are going to engage with Cuba because trade is going to lead to liberal democracy. And so that's a sort of analogy to that question of cooperation and contract will lead to greater communion. So is that actually true, that cooperation can lead to communion? And if so, what would we have to do in the modern economy to move from a sort of highly contractual view to one that is deeper, that actually reflects communion more than
Okay. Well, I don't think you can have communion if you don't have a community. And I think one way to build community, or to at least have the possibility of community, is to have some common meeting point or common task. So it's possible, I think, I mean, I don't know how you can establish bonds of communion if you're not together in some fashion. And the marketplace provides one way of doing that. Doesn't have to be, but it can provide that. And it's one of the few places where we regularly encounter strangers, right? So yes, where's the best place to develop communion is in the family, but you only live with a limited number of people, right? Uh, so I think that's the promise of it. One of the consequences of division of labor and efficiency is that you get very large units, right? You get a massive company, a massive labor force, and it becomes difficult to build up the world. That world becomes dominated by a contract, right? I'll get back to that in a minute. Um, so we see a bit of a rebellion against that in recent decades with people who prefer to work in a smaller environment, right? So I don't want to go to a chain restaurant. I want to go to a place which is run by a family. I want to go to a market and buy produce, even though it's more expensive, from the people who made it, so I can talk to them. So you see a little bit of that, people rebelling against that impersonalization. So I would say that that's the difficulty or the obstacles to communion coming out of commercial community is partly a function of size, right? So uh, workers who are like 5 or 6 people starting a business together they tend to have friendships and more than just the contractual engagements. So that's what I'd say about that. But on a deeper principled level, and I'm actually now embarrassed that I got through 12 C words and didn't have covenant in one of them. That's pretty bad. But a covenant, so what's a covenant? A covenant is a relationship with people where one person says, I give. So what is a covenant in the scriptural covenant is, you'll be my people, I will be your God. That's it. That's what a covenant is. It doesn't specify for any purpose or whatever. I will be your God, you'll be my people. That's a covenant. The closest we have to that is marriage. I will be, right? That's what we're going to go to marriage. I will be your husband. I take you as my wife. That's it, right? That's what a marriage is. When I teach my students about this, I say, a contract, like you have a cell phone contract, you have a lease, it's 10 pages, right? You sign up for, I don't know, just some sort of app to buy fast food, and the terms and conditions are 7,000 words, right? And yet, marriage, which is much more important than that, is only maybe 30 words. And a covenant between God and his people is actually 6 words, or whatever, 8 words. I will be your God, you'll be my people, right? So a contract specifies a relationship. It specifies the duration. It specifies all the tasks. You will do this, you will do that, other thing. But they're both relationships, and they're both codified relationships. And it's possible to see a contract as on the way to a covenant, right? So you could have a contractual relationship that over time becomes lived as a covenant, right? So, for example, in my own professional life, aside from the priestly work that I do, in my journalism work, in my work at Cardus, I don't have contracts, right? So it's a cooperative relationship that's developed to become a bit more like a covenant. Business people who work together over time sometimes don't bother with all the stuff of contracts. They ship things. I don't send the terms. I don't ask for a signature. They pay me. So you move a little bit from the contractual world towards something that might be more covenantal and communion-like. So I think that's a place to start, and it could go in that direction. However, it's also possible to go in the other direction, right? So, in fact, the story of biblical Israel is they go from I will be your God, you'll be my people, to an increasingly sophisticated contractual relationship, or rather experiencing the covenant as more of a contractual thing. So you've got the different provisions, you observe these, and so on. So that dynamic is there, always back and forth. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I think if I was to redo the talk, I would say that the economy in Genesis is a covenantal relationship. And then once you're outside the covenantal relationship, then you have to resort to contracts, because contracts are based on the very realistic, pardon me, on the reality that there may be incentives to cheat or to be lazy or not to deliver or whatever. That's why we have a contract, which is perfectly reasonable. But contracts belong, if you want to say, to the post-lapsarian world. Covenants are there from the beginning. And I think, but good contractual relationships can lead to covenants. I'll give you one example, and this is reflected, pardon me, in our laws, especially our rental laws. There are many contracts that when they reach their expiry date, so this would be employment contracts, leases, so forth, if you don't do anything, they become quasi-covenants, right? So the contract is finished. I'll hire you for 12 months. After the 12 months, if the other party does anything, the person still comes to work, obligations to be paid are there, and the contract sort of has a existence, even though it doesn't, the date has expired. Same thing with the lease, right? If you have a lease, comes a certain date, the lease is over, you have to vacate the property. But if you don't, and nobody does anything, there's a relationship that is presumed, even in our laws, that says that the labor relationship, the property relationship, even beyond the contract, because the contract establishes a relationship, and that relationship is given the kind of the bias of deepening and enduring even beyond the letter of the law. So we even have that kind of way of thinking in our contracts. So that's a fruitful way to think about this is, are you in a contract that's moving towards a covenant, or are you in a contract that is designed to prevent a covenant? On the last point, that was the way people thought for a long time, is that economic freedom was inseparable from political freedom, which is inseparable from religious freedom, inseparable from legal protections. And that was the idea with Cuba, with China, other parts of the world. It had a very reasonable, it had a very persuasive logic to it. But that's the nature of history, is that things sometimes turn out not like you think. And on that particular question, the consensus that was in Canada shared by everybody, like everybody, on China especially, Cuba a little bit less so, but especially on China, has now changed. So that's a big change.
I'll just note on the covenant, going back to that, there are actually profound economic consequences to that a covenantal relationship is one that is built on high levels of trust. And There's actually a fair amount of economic data. We were discussing this earlier, that societies based on high levels of trust, i.e. that are more on the covenantal side of things, have significantly lower transaction costs. And in an economy where transaction costs are lower, currency flows more, and actually the cost of doing business are lower, and societies tend to be more productive. So there's profound economic, it's again a sort of reflection or an echo of the way it was meant to be to some extent. Okay, so let's move out into the crowd, and I'm going to, so just a couple of notes. Cardus is pretty committed to civility. I'm not worried about anything from you folks, but this is the thing we say all the time. If you're going to ask a question, be gentle, be kind, be civil. I'm not expecting anything else,
right?
But I just wanted to note it.
But we do expect questions,
and we do expect questions. If you're gonna say more of a comment, actually, I'll just tell you to stop. Okay. So,
oh, look at that! The Shire is already moving over there.
Okay. But John, I'd love to hear your question. You go first.
If there might be significant difference in the workforce between people that, if you said, "What do you do?" they would say, "I am."
Right.
I am a journalist. I am a priest. I'm
right.
an paleontologist. I am a lawyer.
Right.
Versus people would say, "I work on an assembly line," or
right.
"I flip burgers." That's of course compartmentalized and only for the compensation jobs. Who would say, "I am a burger flipper"? As
right. Okay. No. I think someone would probably say, "I work at such and such a place," rather than "I am such and such a thing." So that's one of that goes back to my point on compartmentalization, is that certain jobs allow you to see things like whole tasks, or let's say you see a project as opposed to just one part of a project. And the astonishing productivity of the modern economy from compartmentalizing and dividing tasks does create a cadre of jobs that frustrate the capacity to see a project as a whole and to be able to point to something and say, I did that, right? So, uh, even now where our newspaper columns are sort of these digital bytes that fly around, I can say, I did that, right? A carpenter who builds a piece of furniture and say, I built that. The carpenter who puts in, a frame on an assembly line of mobile homes can't really point to any home and say, or I did that. And so he has a less of a connection with the job and probably would likely to say, I do this, or I work at that rather than I am something. Whereas a farmer or a shepherd or something might say, or I'm a rancher, because you see the wholeness of the project. And I think that's one of the challenges of the contemporary economy, that this astonishing productivity that's released by the division of labor, by compartmentalizing things, means we're a bit alienated from, that's the term, right, from the 19th century, alienated from, Marx was thinking more about alienated from the value that was created, but you're also alienated from the product. And that's a problem. That's part of the uh, contraction from work. So you get all the toil. All work has some toil, but you don't get the creative connection. Yeah, that's probably how they do speak about it.
I think there's also, companies try to impose that, like Subway, if they go like, I'm a sandwich artist, right? And I do think this is one of the challenges of in our society. We did some work on trades and labor, and there are cultural status hierarchies, right? And I think to some extent the answer to that is, what is the cultural status hierarchy? And one of the things we've tried to do, Renz has tried to do on things like skilled trades, for instance, is to actually recognize that there is dignity and meaning in work that has, often or heretofore been seen as a lesser.
I'm a barista versus I sell coffee.
Correct. Yeah. Some of them are hokey, and like Subway, I don't think anyone calls himself a sandwich artist, but
Making a good sandwich. I mean, in the Subway, it's kind of compartmentalized. But making a good sandwich is actually
I will say that
it's
in
a good thing.
France they have something. French love their honors. It's because they don't win anything in rugby or soccer, but they have this thing called the les honneurs de métier. So it's like honors given to people who are chefs, who are waiters, who are tradespeople, and it's something we've tried to, in our policy, get in Canada. So let's go, Chris, and then James.
And I'm just going to hand people the mic for the sake of
Yeah.
For the sake of the recording. No one wanted to hear John anyway, so that's fine. They can read them. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed your talks, very thought-provoking. I wondered, much of it seems like the premise of your talk is sort of a contrasting narrative between pre and post-fall. What was in the garden and perhaps now what is after, and trying to compare the two. And I wondered, we can get into supra or infralapsarianism and whether or not God foreknew the fall and what he wanted to do after that and so on. But it does seem to me the overarching narrative of Scripture is that we're going from the garden to a city, and that the city is necessarily built by a division of labor, by a very multivariate, talented group of people, and that to draw contrast to the garden, to what we are today, perhaps. Also, I wondered what your thoughts are on where we are going and how we get there, because of God's, like, he didn't fully reveal himself in the garden. He knew he had to come and be that which he created in Jesus Christ to fully reveal himself and give us his word, and then head to the city.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I mean, where are we and where are we going does sort of have a certain broad remit to it. So this is a very interesting dynamic, a little bit related to what I said about that we find it hard to understand the biblical world. So the city is very important. The city seems, in a way, somehow less pure than the, say, agrarian world of the garden. Very interesting phenomenon now. I'm finding all kinds of young Christian couples, they move out of the city and they want to raise goats or, hogs or chickens. And I find it quite mysterious. But anyway, it's a thing. desire to live close to the land, even if they don't have to, because there's some value in that. I understand that's the point. So the status of the city in the scripture and then in the Christian tradition is an interesting one because the the world before the fall, so all of human history is after the fall, right? That's our life. So it's not like there's half and half, it's just a little tiny bit. But the wisdom of Genesis is that it provides a vision of what is the original identity and vocation of man. And it doesn't seem to include the city. So maybe the city is what happens after the fall, and then the city is redeemed. But certainly the reality of the city, the status of Jerusalem, the holy city, the city was built, the temple was built in the city, the image of the heavenly Jerusalem, it's, you know, the image of Revelation about the eschaton is not the garden, it's the city. So what does that mean? Whereas the rise of the city brings with it all of the impersonality. Like, you know, in a city, you can live in an apartment building with 1,000 of people and not know anybody's name. That seems very contrary to basic Christian community. So you go to a village where you know people. So it's interesting because the city, the city in the scriptures and the city in the Christian tradition is essential, right? The apostles went, as it were, from the rural, from the backwaters to the city, Jerusalem, and then from there to the Caput Mundi of Rome. So it's a good question. And then the reality of, or the image of the holy city as our heavenly home is the redeemed city. But our experience of the city, it seems to militate against, you know, personal connection, against harmony with nature, and so forth. So there's this long tradition in Christianity of leaving the city, right, from St. Anthony, St. Benedict, right up to the families who are raising goats now, to leave the city behind somehow for greater harmony with nature and perhaps even greater harmony with God. But it's an interesting. I'm glad you raised it because I spoke about the garden and being outside the garden, but the whole status of the city, whether it's a necessary evil, whether it's an evil to be redeemed, or whether it's a good like the city, I think that's harder to say, because we get the great cities, right? The great cities that appear in the scriptures. First, the great cities of Egypt, and then you have the great city, the Decapolis outside of Jerusalem. Then you have the other great city, Babylon, all these great, Nineveh, the great city. They're usually associated with not with iniquity, but then you have Jerusalem, the holy city. So not a very satisfactory answer, I'm afraid.
I'll also say, Father Raymond, you should read Jane Jacobs because your view of the
Right.
city is not the same as hers. Like she'd have a more positive view.
I like the city actually.
Okay.
I'm baffled by these goat raisers. These,
Okay.
these
Okay, so
goat herders.
we've got
that are out there.
I'm pro goat, delicious and curry. James, and then I think you're next, and then is there one at the back? So 1, 2, 3, 4.
Wow, lots of people.
Okay, we've got lots of questions. So what time runs are we at? 8:52. So we're gonna go
Quickly, fast.
Let's go quickly.
My question maybe builds on John's, which is in the modern economy, and specifically, I think the knowledge-based workplace. One of the phenomena is that there seems to be a lot of movement between careers. You have people moving from one thing to another to another. What's the implication of that in your eyes on man's perception of himself and self-actualization, this pursuit of self-actualization through his work, and sort of what are the implications, and maybe what is the response, or what ought it to be?
I think that for those creative class workers who they can really engage the fact that what I produce is. I'm not building something, I'm actually thinking something, which is more, my capacity to think and to be creative is more in the image of God than my capacity to build something. Both things are there in that sense, because, God doesn't build something, he thinks something into being or speaks something into being. So I think in that sense that creative jobs, in that sense, have a positive dimension in that they emphasize the imago Dei in us. But that's also the danger, because we can become very prideful and say, no, I'm like God. I can, I'm someone who tends the earth is less likely to think that I'm like God, because I depend on this earth and I don't make the soil, I don't make the seeds. Whereas a creative worker can think that way. On the question of switching jobs, I think the social consequences are negative. I mean, not that I don't really have a view what people should work for the same company their whole life. My father did, but when you're in a relationship where you're looking for the next relationship, you become less trustworthy, you become more self-centered, you become less inclined to work for others, because you're not going to be there longer. So I think it does erode our capacity for investment or building up relations with others, right? Or we look at them in investments as opposed to relationships, right? So if I'm going to work in this factory or this shop for my whole life, I might want a relationship with my other workers. If I'm only going to be here for 3 or 4 years before I go somewhere else, I may only invest what I think is I'm going to get out of it. So I do think it tends to be it makes social relationships more difficult.
Thank you. I guess one of the differences between the part 1 world and the part 2 world is the employer-employee relationship. And of course, in the sort of neoclassical model, which I was trained in, that's a very simple, very transactional relationship. But I'm guessing that, from your perspective in the Christian tradition, that relationship is conceived of as somewhat differently, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Okay, very broadly, but very quickly. So there are 2 great dynamics in history about power. So one is the father-son dynamic. So the father who has power uses it, even sacrifices it for the good of the son. That's the Christian Trinitarian view of history. And then there's the Hegelian view of history, which is that the power in the world is the master-slave dynamic, and the master uses this power to keep the slave down, and the slave finds salvation by overthrowing the master and taking his position. Right? So for those of you unfamiliar with Hegelian philosophy, this is the story of Star Wars. Right? So Star Wars is the contest between the father-son dynamic and the master-slave dynamic, and they put it in the same family, and it's easier to read there than to read Hegelian philosophy. So the question is, where does the employer-employee relationship fall? You could imagine it as a father-son, or towards the father-son end, or towards the master-slave end. And then in between, you have all kinds of things. So you can think of a patron and the patron of an artist, which is kind of like a father-son relationship where he wants the son to flourish and so forth. You can think of it, on the other end, you could think of like a exploitative relationship, which is more like master-slave. Or you can try and find something in the between where it's more of a partnership. So they're trying to eliminate the power dynamic. But so where does the employer-employee relationship? I mean, you've got 2 extremes. You've got the master-slave account of history and the father-son account of history. And where do you put all power relationships in between, whether it's politics, whether it's employment, or something else? So it could be in there.
Well, I'm going to intervene because I used to work for a trade union, which was a Christian one that had a particular view of this. And it was, I actually think there was a different notion and is based on scripture, and it's actually comes out of our social teaching. So laborum, how do you say it? Exercens?
Exercens, yeah.
My kids are studying Latin. I didn't. So I blame the lack of good education in the province. But what John Paul II says of the worker, he says that the worker is an agent capable of deciding for him or herself. And so the relationship with the employer may be in some sense practically hierarchical, just in the sense of like in a military, you've got somebody who's got to do something, or it's not a command and control structure. It's just that it's a vocational or a positional role. But in terms of dignity, the employer and the employee are equals. And that's why the Catholic and the Christian social tradition, my Reformed tradition, are both very pro-labor. And that's why Cardus is very pro-organized labor. and not necessarily in the traditional model of unions which emerged of the Industrial Revolution. There are other ways, but that there is intended to be an equal relationship between the employer in terms of dignity and even power. And so, sort of alluding to Jesus, referring to his disciples, talking about master and slave, he says this, but I call you friends. And so there's a vision, I think, of the workplace in the Christian tradition, which is a sort of cooperative venture between friends who have different gifts and different authorities per se, but not necessarily different in dignity or even in power, even though in reality that may work itself out practically that way. But I think there's a good article in our one of the magazines we publish and comment by the director of policy for American Compass, which is a conservative think tank in the States that's sort of responding against some of the neoclassical economic orthodoxies, who writes on this. So I think that's the model that comes out of our tradition. So I don't know if that helps, but it does. I think it's very different than the sort of contractual one and the sort of master-servant relationship, which is where most of the history of most of our employee labor law and so on actually comes out of master-servant relationships, and of course back in time to master-slave and so on. So just and then this will be, we've got more questions than we have time. So I'm going to ask that this is the last question because it's 9 o'clock, Renza. Father Raymond is contractually obligated to stay until the last question is answered, and so you can ply him.
I just said I don't have a contract.
Yeah, sorry, covenantal.
He's not even listening to me.
He's going to fulfill his part of the covenant by drinking a cold lager and answering your question. So this will be our last question.
You can check, Molly can take the last question there. She's going. We'll take two.
Oh, I thought it
There
was.
you go ahead.
Okay.
The
Father Raymond is going to make the call here.
The gentleman with the beard is not Molly.
Okay.
Okay.
Not in the church.
Thank
Molly's
you.
one of my former students at Queen, so she gets preferential treatment.
Thank you, Father Raymond. I'll ask, I had two questions in mind. I'll ask the quicker one since it's already 9. When it comes to compartmentalization, I was curious, it seems like with compartmentalization, there could be less creativity opportunities if someone in the example you were giving was like doing the screw on the carriage as it was going by. And so I was curious if you also think that compartmentalization also sort of lessens opportunities for people at like the higher leadership levels of that. If like whether you think that the person who's just like twisting the screw sort of outsources all of the creativity and opportunities for expression of like being in the image of God to people higher up in the chain, or if the people higher up in the chain also experience a certain loss of opportunity because they're not actually like ever touching a screw.
Right. Thank you for the question. I think probably the people at the higher levels are able to see the whole project in a way that the more compartmentalized workers don't. So they have a greater access to the whole project, seeing things as wholes. But there is a certain distance, right, from the work itself. So you could be the head of an oil company, the head of an auto company, and actually in your daily work never actually encounter oil or an oil rig or a car or whatever. I mean, it's quite possible that you could. So there's a certain unreality that you begin to see the company, perhaps that you lead, as just a series of concepts or figures, and you lose contact both with the product and with the workers. That is a reality. So there's also a distance even then from the actual project. One thing I'd say that is maybe changing, I don't know, because we're in the middle of it, so it's hard to say, but an enormous amount of economic specialization was based on the communication of information. So in economics, our microeconomic models of how firms work, how individuals work, assume perfect information. But there's no such thing. We never see that, right? But we assume it because we need to assume it for our models to work. And it's good that we used to make that assumption, but perfect information was very hard to get. Right? So a lot of the reason for specialization was that you don't need to know how to build a car. You just need to know how to do this little part of it. You don't need to know this. Technology is changing some of that, right? So, for example, if you're making, I don't know, making some handicraft at home, the reason no one else can get your products, they don't know about it. There's no way to get information, so you can only sell to people in your locality. The fact now that things like the internet, Etsy, right? So if you're making, I don't know, dolls in Athabasca, somebody in Cape Breton Island can order them from you, which didn't exist before because they couldn't get the information. So the radical change of information, make information very accessible and very inexpensive, maybe allowing a little less specialization. So someone who takes a project from beginning to end can now do it in a way because the informational costs, both of knowledge and of advertising, are minimal, right? So there's a chance that that's changing. I don't know exactly, but to your specific question, yes, that everybody experiences some distance from the project when you divide it up to make it more efficient.
Thank you. How about you join me in saying thank you to Father Raymond for